The millionaire was paralyzed when he saw the nurse's pendant. It was the same as his missing daughter's. Arthur Blake lay on the stiff hospital bed, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling the air, mingling with the faint beeping of the machines around him. He had never been one for hospitals. In fact, he had avoided them his entire life, managing his health with the best doctors his wealth could afford. But now, at 70, he could no longer escape it. The dull ache in his chest had worsened in recent months, and for the first time, Arthur found himself vulnerable, completely at the mercy of others. Before I continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next fantastic stories. It was an unfamiliar feeling for a man who had controlled every aspect of his life, his business empire, his social circles, and even the people around him. Yet, as he lay there, staring at the ceiling tiles, a deeper ache persisted, one that no amount of wealth or power could heal. Years ago, he had known love and joy in a way he thought would last forever. His daughter, Lily, had been his entire world. Her laughter used to fill their grand home, and her gentle presence had been a light in his life that even the coldest boardroom deals couldn't replicate. Arthur remembered how she would run to him, her silver pendant bouncing around her neck, the small lily charm catching the light as she laughed and hugged him. That pendant was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of their bond, a connection he'd believed nothing could sever. He'd had it custom-made for her on her 10th birthday, a delicate, intricate piece that mirrored her name, Lily, and seemed to embody her spirit, fragile yet resilient. But 15 years ago, all of that had changed. Lily had disappeared without a trace, leaving Arthur's life hollow and empty. He remembered that night with painful clarity, the hours of waiting, of frantic calls to friends, to hospitals, and eventually to the police. He had hired the best private investigators, poured countless resources into finding her, following every lead, every rumor. Yet the mystery only deepened. Each hopeful lead had ended in heartbreak, each trail going cold, leaving him with nothing but an aching void and that same haunting question: where had she gone? Lily's sudden absence was a wound that time could not heal, a constant reminder of his failure to protect the one person who mattered most. The grief had transformed him. Arthur, once a lively and affectionate father, had become cold and reclusive, retreating further into his work, using business as a shield against the loneliness that threatened to consume him. Even in his sprawling estate, he felt haunted by her memory. Everywhere he looked, he saw traces of Lily, the empty piano she used to play, the books she loved, the garden she had planted flowers in as a little girl. He had lost not just his daughter, but a part of himself, and despite his best efforts, he had never been able to find closure. Over the years, he had come to accept that he might never know what happened to her, but the pain lingered, an open wound that refused to heal. As Arthur lay in the hospital, his mind drifting in and out of painful memories, the door opened softly. A young nurse entered, moving quietly as she approached his bed with a gentle, practiced ease. He had noticed her before. Emily was her name, he recalled from the small name badge pinned to her uniform. She had been his night nurse for the past week, and though they had exchanged few words, he found her presence oddly comforting. Emily had a quiet strength about her, a kindness in her eyes that reminded him faintly of Lily. She was always attentive, adjusting his pillows, checking his fore, and making sure he was comfortable, all without him having to ask. This evening, as she leaned over him to check his pulse, Arthur's gaze drifted to her neckline, where a silver pendant rested against her uniform. His breath caught, his heart suddenly beating faster. He blinked, trying to steady himself, wondering if his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, it was unmistakable. The pendant was the same delicate lily he had given to his daughter so many years ago. The familiar shape, the way the petals curled, the fine craftsmanship, it was all there, exactly as he remembered it. It was as if a ghost from his past had suddenly appeared, an echo of a life he thought he had lost forever. Arthur's mind reeled, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It couldn't be. That pendant had been one of a kind, crafted specifically for Lily. He had never seen another like it, and he knew that Lily would have guarded it with her life. His hands clenched at the hospital sheet as he struggled to calm himself, to control the surge of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. How could this young nurse have such a personal, precious item, something that had belonged to his missing daughter? He felt a strange, conflicted rush, a glimmer of hope mixed with a rising dread. He wanted to ask her about it, to demand an explanation, but he hesitated, unsure of what to say, of how to even begin such a conversation. Memories of Lily flooded his mind, clouding his thoughts as he recalled her laughter, her warm hugs, the way she would proudly show him her pendant, claiming it was her good luck charm. Seeing that pendant now, after all these years, felt like reopening a wound he had tried so hard to close. Yet he couldn't look away, his gaze fixed on the small charm as if it held the answers to all the questions he had been asking since the day she disappeared. Emily, oblivious to the turmoil her pendant had stirred, continued her routine, checking his vitals and noting down his information. She noticed the tension in his posture, her brow furrowing with concern. "Mr. Blake, is everything all right?" she asked softly, her voice gentle. Arthur managed a slight nod, his throat tight as he struggled to keep his composure. He didn't want to betray the storm of emotions churning inside him. How could he explain what he was feeling without sounding irrational? He closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath, his mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to ask. As Emily finished her checks and turned to leave, Arthur opened his eyes, watching her go with a heavy heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that this pendant, the same one he had once given his beloved daughter, was somehow connected to Lily. But how? The possibility felt too incredible, too painful to consider. Had Lily given the pendant to someone else? Had she somehow crossed paths with Emily? The questions were endless, each one pressing down on him with a new weight, rekindling a hope he had long abandoned. For the rest of the night, Arthur lay in his hospital bed, unable to sleep, his thoughts consumed by the pendant and the memories it brought back. He replayed every detail of that evening over and over, each thought more torturous than the last. The image of Lily's face, her laughter, her presence, mingled with the image of Emily's calm, unknowing expression. As the hours slipped by, he resolved to find out the truth, even if it meant reopening old wounds. The hours ticked by slowly, but Arthur's mind was racing, unable to settle. His gaze drifted to the clock on the wall as he lay in the dim light of his hospital room, his thoughts fixed on Emily and the silver lily pendant she wore so casually around her neck. The image of it haunted him, pulling him back into the past, flooding him with memories he had long tried to bury. How could this young nurse, a stranger, be wearing something so deeply connected to Lily, his lost daughter? Arthur shifted slightly, his breath catching in his chest as he remembered the day he had given the pendant to Lily. She'd been a wide-eyed 10-year-old, her face lighting up with joy as he clasped the necklace around her small neck. He had spent months designing it with a jeweler, choosing each detail so it would be perfect for her. She'd worn it every day after that, never letting it out of her sight, a small reminder of the bond they shared. And now, 15 years later, he was seeing that same piece of jewelry on a young woman he'd never met before. The pang of both hope and pain was almost unbearable. Emily moved quietly around his bed, checking his vitals one last time before her shift ended. Arthur watched her closely, noting her gentle, precise movements. She seemed oblivious to the turmoil her presence had stirred within him, unaware of how that single pendant had rattled him to his core. He thought of speaking up, of asking her about the necklace, but his throat tightened, the words refusing to form. He wasn't ready for answers yet. They felt too heavy, too close to the pain he had tried to forget. "All right, Mr. Blake," Emily said softly, her voice a calm whisper in the dim room. "I'll be leaving now, but another nurse will be taking over until the morning. If you need anything, just press the call button, and they'll assist you." She smiled gently, a warmth in her eyes that reminded him, painfully, of Lily's kindness. He nodded slowly, unable to meet her gaze, his heart pounding with questions he wasn't yet ready to ask. With one last, quiet glance, Emily turned and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the weight of memories he hadn't wanted to relive. After a few minutes, another nurse entered the room, her footsteps light and swift. She was an older woman, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that was clear from the way she held herself. She introduced herself as Nurse Harper, taking a seat by his bed and reviewing his chart. Arthur studied her, his mind still tangled in thoughts of Emily and the pendant. There was something he needed to know, something that would either quell the flicker of hope in his heart or ignite it into an inferno he wasn't sure he could face. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out in a rough whisper. "Nurse Harper, he began, choosing his words carefully. "The nurse who was here earlier. Emily, I believe. Do you know her well?" He tried to keep his tone casual, hiding the urgency he felt, the need to know more about the young woman who had unknowingly stirred up the most painful memories of his life. Nurse Harper looked up, slightly surprised by his question, but her expression softened as she spoke. "Ah, yes, Emily," she replied with a gentle smile. "She's a wonderful nurse, very dedicated. She's new to the hospital, actually, but she's already made an impression. The patients like her, and she has a way of making them feel at ease." Her words were warm, filled with a quiet admiration that reassured him. Arthur nodded, trying to keep his face neutral as he absorbed her response. Emily sounded like a good person, someone trustworthy and kind, qualities that made the mystery of the pendant all the more confusing. He hesitated, feeling a tension building in his chest. He didn't want to reveal too much, but he needed to know more about her. "She seems young," he ventured, glancing briefly at Nurse Harper, who was watching him with a slight curiosity. "Do you happen to know where she's from? Or if she has any family nearby?" His voice shook slightly as he spoke, betraying the depth of his interest. He needed answers, even if they brought him no closer to Lily. Nurse Harper gave him a thoughtful look, clearly sensing that there was more to his questions than mere curiosity. "I believe Emily mentioned once that she grew up in the next town over," Nurse Harper replied, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall the details. "But she doesn't talk much about her family. She's very private, though she did mention a close friend from her childhood who meant a lot to her. Emily's a bit reserved when it comes to her past, but from what I can tell, she's here on her own, dedicated to her work." The mention of a close friend made Arthur's chest tighten. A flicker of hope stirred within him, but he suppressed it, trying to remain rational. This could still be nothing more than coincidence. Nurse Harper seemed to study him, as if sensing his silent turmoil. "Is there a reason you're asking, Mr. Blake?" she asked gently, her tone cautious but compassionate. Arthur hesitated, unsure of how much to say. He didn't want to share the full story, not yet. But he needed Nurse Harper to understand, to give him more insight into this mysterious nurse with the pendant. "It's just," he trailed off, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought she reminded me of someone. Someone I used to know a long time ago." Nurse Harper nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "Sometimes, certain people bring back memories we thought we'd buried," she said quietly. "Emily has that effect on people, I think. There's a kindness in her that's rare." Her words struck him deeply, and he felt the ache in his heart sharpen. The possibility that Emily might be connected to Lily was beginning to feel more real, and yet the fear of disappointment held him back. He had spent years hoping, only to have those hopes crushed time and time again. As Nurse Harper rose to check his four, Arthur's gaze drifted back to the door, the memory of Emily's gentle face etched in his mind. The pendant she wore, the kindness in her eyes, the faint familiarity he felt in her presence, all of it haunted him, each detail like a puzzle piece that refused to fit together. He wanted answers, needed them, but he feared what he might uncover. The possibility of finding a connection to Lily felt like a fragile flame, one he didn't dare blow on too hard for fear it would extinguish. Throughout the night, he lay awake, his mind circling around Emily and the mysterious connection between them. He knew he would have to confront her, to ask about the pendant, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answers that might follow. Arthur's sleepless nights stretched on, his thoughts tangled in memories and questions he was not yet ready to voice. The soft beeps of the hospital monitors punctuated the silence, an almost rhythmic backdrop to the storm of emotions inside him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's face, her bright smile, the way she used to run to him with open arms, her pendant catching the light. That same pendant now rested around the neck of a young nurse, a stranger who had unwittingly pulled him back into a chapter of his life he had tried to bury. But why? How could such a thing even be possible? His heart felt heavy with the memories of the day he had given Lily that pendant. She was only 10 years old, her eyes wide with excitement as he fastened it around her neck. "Now you'll have a part of me with you wherever you go," he had told her, his voice gentle. She had hugged him tightly, her small arms wrapping around his neck, and he remembered feeling a swell of pride and love he had never known before. In those early days, before the demands of his business had pulled him away, He had believed he would always be there for her. And yet, life had a way of changing the things we believed to be certain. 4 years after she disappeared, that memory had haunted him, a reminder of the promises he had failed to keep. He had always hoped that one day she would walk back through the door, wearing that pendant as if nothing had changed. But as the years passed and the pain settled into a dull ache, he had come to accept that he would never know what happened to her. It had become easier, in a way, to let the memory of her fade, to let his love turn into something he could contain and manage, hidden deep within his heart. But Emily's pendant had shattered that fragile piece he had built around himself. The sight of it had reignited something inside him, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find a trace of Lily in this world. Yet that hope was dangerous, like a flame too close to fuel. It threatened to consume him, to pull him back into a place of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. He wasn't sure he had the strength to go down that road again, to reopen a wound that had never truly healed. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, Arthur felt his exhaustion settling into his bones. He turned his head slightly, watching the soft rays spread across the sterile hospital room, casting a gentle glow on the stark white walls. He felt the weight of the sleepless hours pressing down on him, yet his mind remained sharp, focused on one thing: finding a way to speak to Emily, to understand the impossible connection between her and the daughter he had lost. Later that morning, Nurse Harper returned to check on him, her kind face softened by a tired smile. She adjusted his pillows and asked if he'd managed to get any sleep, to which he simply shook his head. His mind felt raw, and he could barely muster the energy to speak, yet he knew he had to keep going. "Will Emily be back on shift tonight?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. He tried to sound casual, but he saw Nurse Harper's eyebrows lift in mild curiosity. She paused, as if considering her answer, then nodded. "Yes, she'll be back on the evening shift," Nurse Harper replied, her voice gentle. She hesitated for a moment, studying him with a look of quiet empathy. "You know, Mr. Blake, Emily has a way of connecting with her patients. She's very devoted to her work, perhaps because she's seen her share of pain, too. She doesn't talk about it much, but sometimes I think she carries a sadness, a longing, just like the rest of us." Nurse Harper's words lingered, settling over him like a shroud. He wondered what kind of pain Emily could be carrying, what could possibly connect her story to his, and to Lily's? Arthur nodded, absorbing her words in silence. The thought that Emily might also carry her own hidden grief, her own losses, tugged at him. He felt a pang of sympathy for her, this young woman who had somehow, unknowingly, ignited a spark of both hope and sorrow in his heart. It was strange, but for the first time, he found himself wanting to understand her story, to see beyond the professional demeanor she presented. Perhaps in knowing more about her, he could find a way to understand the mystery she had brought into his life. The day crept by slowly, each hour dragging as he waited for the evening to come, for the moment he could see her again. He rehearsed words in his mind, ways to approach the subject delicately, to avoid sounding desperate or intrusive. Yet each time, he found himself at a loss. How could he ask her about something so personal, so painful, without risking reopening his own grief? The pendant was a link to his past, to a version of himself he had buried, and he wasn't sure if he could face that man again. By afternoon, Arthur was restless, feeling the strain of his sleepless night and the weight of his questions. He barely touched his lunch, his appetite dampened by the anticipation of his meeting with Emily. He could feel his heart pounding, a dull, persistent reminder of the ache he had carried for so long. The pendant had brought everything rushing back, memories he had tried to suppress, regrets he had tried to ignore. It was as if the universe was forcing him to confront his past, to face the love he had lost and the questions that still lingered. As evening approached, he found himself growing more anxious, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the thin hospital blanket. He closed his eyes, taking deep breaths to steady himself, to prepare for whatever answers might come. He had spent so many years running from the pain, burying it beneath layers of work and solitude. But now, he felt as if he were on the edge of something inevitable, as though the truth had been waiting patiently for him all this time, ready to reveal itself. Finally, as the shadows of evening began to settle in the room, he heard the familiar soft footsteps in the hallway. His heart quickened, his pulse racing as he anticipated her entrance. A part of him feared what he might learn, but a larger part yearned for the truth, for any fragment of Lily's memory that might still linger in this world. Arthur's heart pounded as he watched Emily, his eyes fixated on the silver pendant resting gently against her collar. He struggled to keep his voice steady, the questions and emotions tangled inside him almost too much to contain. This pendant, its shape, its curves, was unmistakably the same one he had given Lily years ago. He fought to push down the hope that rose in him, the fragile, desperate yearning that maybe, just maybe, this young nurse could somehow be connected to his lost daughter. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to ask, his voice soft but filled with a quiet urgency. "Emily, that pendant you're wearing, it's quite unique." His words hung in the air, heavy and cautious. She looked down instinctively, her fingers brushing over the pendant, her face flickering with a brief, guarded expression. Arthur sensed her hesitation, the way her hand lingered on the necklace as if it held a story too personal to share. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet and distant, as though speaking more to herself than to him. "It's very special to me." Arthur's breath caught, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. He was careful not to press too hard, yet his curiosity and longing were nearly overwhelming. Every part of him wanted to know how she had come to possess it, what it meant to her, and if, somehow, it could lead him back to Lily. But he could sense that Emily was protecting something fragile and deeply personal. He softened his approach, desperate to keep her from retreating completely. "Forgive me for prying," he said gently, forcing a small, careful smile. "But it's rare to see something so finely crafted. It caught my eye." He hoped his tone conveyed genuine curiosity rather than intrusion. Emily's gaze shifted to meet his, a brief flicker of understanding passing between them. She hesitated, her fingers curling protectively around the pendant. "Yes, it's not something I talk about much," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It was a gift, from someone very important to me." Arthur's heart skipped, his pulse quickening with both hope and a growing fear of disappointment. He wanted to know more but sensed that pushing her too soon could cause her to close off completely. Instead, he nodded slowly, letting her see the warmth in his expression, hoping she might trust him enough to say more. He could see a hint of sadness in her eyes, a quiet grief that mirrored the ache he carried inside. She looked away, and he sensed that this pendant was not just a piece of jewelry to her, it was a memory, a piece of someone she'd lost. Emily's voice was soft, almost distant, as she added, "It's all I have left of her." She paused, her eyes drifting as if lost in thought. Arthur felt his chest tighten, the weight of her words hitting him hard. This pendant connected her to someone she had loved deeply, someone who was no longer here. He recognized the look on her face, the familiar blend of sorrow and gratitude. It was a look he had seen in his own reflection, a look that only someone carrying a painful loss could wear. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort or understanding, but the words wouldn't come. For so long, he had been trapped in his own grief, feeling as though he were the only one carrying such a profound emptiness. Yet here was Emily, a stranger, who bore a similar pain in silence. In that moment, he realized that they shared more than he had first thought. They were both tied to someone who had vanished from their lives, leaving behind only memories and small tokens of remembrance. Emily cleared her throat, shifting slightly as though pulling herself back to the present. "I don't usually talk about it," she said, a slight tremor in her voice. "But the pendant reminds me of her. It's like having a part of her close to me, even though she's gone." She offered him a small, bittersweet smile, her gaze softening as she spoke. Arthur nodded, understanding more than he could express. He, too, had clung to memories, to objects that once held Lily's touch, feeling as though they kept her close even after she had slipped away from his life. The urge to ask more questions, to dive deeper, tugged at him, but he restrained himself, sensing that Emily wasn't ready to reveal more. She was protecting something sacred, a memory she wasn't yet willing to share. Arthur felt a pang of regret, but also a deep respect for her need for privacy. He had spent so many years guarding his own pain that he understood the comfort that secrecy could offer, the way it allowed one to hold onto the fragments of someone they had loved. For a while, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, the quiet connection between them growing stronger with each passing second. Arthur felt a strange comfort in her presence, a sense of familiarity he hadn't expected. He wondered if, in some way, this young nurse could help him find the peace he had been searching for since the day Lily disappeared. She was like a bridge between him and the past he had tried so hard to bury, yet had never truly let go. As Emily resumed her duties, she gave him one last look, her eyes filled with a warmth that softened the grief she carried. Arthur watched her leave, feeling a mixture of longing and gratitude. He didn't know if she would ever tell him the full story behind the pendant, but in her quiet, kind presence, he had found a small sense of solace. And perhaps, he thought, there was still time to find the answers he so desperately sought. The hours passed slowly as Arthur lay alone in his hospital room, Emily's quiet words echoing in his mind. She had spoken of the pendant with such reverence, such guarded tenderness, that it was clear it meant the world to her. And as she had spoken, he had felt a strange kinship with her, a recognition of a shared pain that had never fully healed. Though she hadn't offered much detail, her few words had been enough to ignite an ache he thought he'd buried long ago. She, like him, carried memories wrapped in silence and sorrow, bound to someone who was no longer there. Arthur had never expected to feel a connection like this with a stranger, let alone with someone as young and unfamiliar as Emily. He was used to walls, to distance. Years of loss and disappointment had taught him to close himself off, to retreat behind the safety of his own solitude. But Emily had shattered that in an instant. She had entered his life quietly, with no expectations, and had managed, unintentionally, to rekindle memories he had long kept hidden. Her presence had become a haunting comfort, a strange and unexpected balm for a wound he had spent years pretending didn't exist. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he replayed every moment of their interaction, each word and gesture magnified in his mind. The way she had touched the pendant, her fingers brushing over it like a precious memory. The sadness in her eyes, a sadness he knew too well. Her words, "It's all I have left of her." Those words had pierced him deeply, the realization settling in that Emily, too, had loved someone she could no longer hold on to. It was a pain Arthur understood intimately, one that lingered in the quiet spaces between memories and loss. He closed his eyes, letting out a slow, shaky breath as he felt the weight of his own grief pressing down on him. For years, he had tried to live without answers, to tell himself that he could move on without knowing what had happened to Lily. Yet seeing that pendant, hearing Emily's quiet confession, had reopened something within him, a flicker of hope, a yearning he couldn't suppress. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that somehow, he needed to understand Emily's story, to find out how her life had come to intersect with his in such a deeply painful way. But he also feared what he might uncover. What if the connection between them led only to more questions, more uncertainty? He had spent so long bracing himself against the unknown, against the hollow ache of loss, that the thought of opening himself up to it again felt terrifying. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else, a faint, fragile spark of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. The thought that he might still find pieces of Lily's memory in this world, that her presence might live on in unexpected ways, filled him with a bittersweet longing. Throughout the evening, Arthur found himself waiting for Emily's return, though he knew she had already left for the day. He stared at the door, half expecting her to walk in, to resume her gentle care, her silent presence a reminder that he wasn't alone in his grief. He had so many questions, so many things he wanted to ask, but he knew he couldn't rush her, couldn't force her to reveal a story she held so closely to her heart. He would have to be patient, to wait and hope that in time, she might trust him enough to tell him more. Nurse Harper checked in on him periodically, her voice warm as she asked if he needed anything. He offered her a polite smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere, his mind drifting back to Emily and the mysterious connection she held to his past. Harper noticed his distant expression, her gaze softening as she patted his hand. "You seem deep in thought, Mr. Blake," she observed gently. He hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to reveal too much, didn't want to share the quiet turmoil Emily had stirred within him. But a part of him also yearned to speak, to let someone else understand the weight he was carrying. After a long pause, he finally said, "Sometimes, someone enters your life, and they remind you of things you thought you'd left behind." His voice was barely more than a whisper, the words filled with an ache he couldn't disguise. Nurse Harper nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a knowing compassion. "It sounds like you're holding on to something painful," she replied, her tone gentle. "Maybe someone you lost?" Arthur's breath caught, the truth of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Yes," he admitted softly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Someone very dear to me." He didn't offer more, but Harper gave his hand a comforting squeeze, her presence warm and understanding. She didn't pry, didn't press for details. She simply offered him a quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone in his sorrow, a reminder that even the deepest wounds didn't have to be borne in solitude. It was a comfort, a small but significant relief, and Arthur felt a quiet gratitude toward her, even as his thoughts remained fixed on Emily. As night fell, Arthur drifted into a restless sleep, his dreams filled with fragments of memories, with Lily's laughter and the flash of silver around her neck. In his dreams, he saw Emily too, her face blurred with the edges of memory, her eyes filled with the same sadness he had seen in himself. He awoke several times, each time feeling the pull of the past, the weight of a mystery he wasn't sure he was ready to solve. Yet, as morning broke, he knew that he couldn't turn back now. Emily's presence had reignited something in him, and he couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend he didn't feel the stirring of old wounds and old hopes. By the time the sun began to rise, filling his room with a soft, golden light, Arthur felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. He knew that his path would not be easy, that searching for answers might reopen wounds he had carefully hidden. But he also knew that he needed to find peace, to understand the pieces of his past that still lingered in the present. He felt the quiet beginnings of a resolve forming within him, a determination to face the unknown, no matter where it might lead. And as he lay there, waiting for the day to unfold, he realized that Emily had given him something he hadn't felt in years, a purpose. Arthur's condition had improved gradually over the past few days. His doctor had informed him that his heart was responding well to the treatment, and the medication had helped stabilize his breathing. While the medical updates were positive, his mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of Emily and the lingering mystery of the pendant. His body was healing, but his heart felt caught between pain and hope, unable to rest until he uncovered the truth. The morning he was discharged, a crisp autumn breeze filled the hospital lobby as he waited for his car, its coolness sharp against his skin. He should have been feeling grateful for his recovery, thankful to leave the confines of the hospital. But instead, he was almost reluctant to go, reluctant to leave behind the gentle presence of Emily and the connection she seemed to hold to his past. His mind lingered on her words, her quiet sadness, and that silver pendant, the delicate, familiar lily. It had become an anchor to something he couldn't quite reach but was desperate to understand. The ride home was quiet, the car gliding through city streets and then through the winding countryside roads that led to his estate. Arthur sat in silence, gazing out the window as the landscape rushed past, his thoughts swirling. He remembered how, as a young man, he'd raced down these same roads with Lily beside him, her laughter filling the car. She had been the heart of his world, a warmth that softened his otherwise distant and driven nature. Her disappearance had changed him, hardening him in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. As the car approached the large iron gates of his estate, Arthur felt a pang of emptiness. The house loomed in the distance, a grand structure set against the sprawling landscape, beautiful but cold. Over the years, he had filled it with art, antiques, and the luxuries his wealth could afford, but it had always felt hollow without Lily. She had given life to the rooms with her laughter, her music, her presence. In her absence, the house had become a museum, a place filled with memories rather than warmth. He entered the house quietly, dismissing the staff with a nod. The silence greeted him, an old but familiar companion, as he walked through the halls. He paused by the piano in the sitting room, where Lily had spent countless afternoons, her fingers dancing over the keys as she played her favorite pieces. He closed his eyes, imagining her there, the light from the windows casting a golden glow around her as she looked up at him with that bright, infectious smile. It was a memory he held close, one of the few that had managed to survive the years without losing its vividness. Yet, now, the memory felt different, sharpened by his recent encounter with Emily and the emotions she had stirred within him. That pendant, identical to the one he had gifted Lily, haunted him with its mystery. How could it have ended up in Emily's possession? He replayed their brief conversations over and over, dissecting each word, each glance, searching for clues he might have missed. She had guarded her words carefully, revealing only that the pendant had belonged to someone dear to her, a friend, she'd said. Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that this friend might somehow be connected to Lily, though the idea felt both impossible and painfully tempting. In the quiet of his study, Arthur sat down, his gaze drifting over the framed photographs on his desk. There was one of Lily, taken when she was just a young girl, her hair wild and free, her smile bright with unfiltered joy. She was wearing the pendant in the photo, the delicate silver lily resting against her chest. He picked up the frame, running his thumb over the glass, his heart aching with a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The pendant was a piece of her, a connection that had been severed the day she disappeared, yet now it seemed to have resurfaced in the hands of someone else. Days passed, but thoughts of Emily lingered, refusing to fade as he'd hoped they might. Her presence had become like a quiet whisper in his mind, a reminder of the mystery he was now entwined in. Each morning, he found himself wondering about her, wondering if she was at the hospital, going about her routine, unaware of the impact she had left on him. The memory of her hand brushing over the pendant, her gentle voice, and the sadness in her eyes had imprinted itself deeply, leaving him restless and unresolved. Unable to shake the feeling, Arthur began to gather the strength to go back. He needed answers, not only for himself but for Lily's memory. This wasn't merely about uncovering the past, it was about finding peace, about honoring the life of the daughter he had loved and lost. The thought of returning to the hospital filled him with both dread and anticipation, the fear of disappointment warring with the faint glimmer of hope that Emily's story might hold some long-sought answers. One afternoon, Arthur found himself standing by the windows of his study, looking out at the autumn leaves falling in the garden. The colors were vibrant, alive, a stark contrast to the quiet ache that had settled within him. He thought about how many seasons had come and gone without Lily, each one marking time like a silent witness to her absence. And yet, here he was, with the faintest possibility that he might learn something about her fate, that the memory of her might live on in a way he had never expected. That evening, he made a decision. He would go back to the hospital, find a reason to speak with Emily once more. He knew he would have to approach carefully, that he couldn't demand answers from her, but he was willing to wait, to listen, to piece together whatever fragments of her story she was willing to share. He needed to know more, needed to understand the strange connection they shared, the quiet, unspoken bond that had drawn him back to his own memories. In the solitude of his home, surrounded by memories that felt both comforting and haunting, Arthur resolved to face whatever truth lay ahead. The next morning, Arthur woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The thought of returning to the hospital, of seeing Emily again, filled him with both apprehension and a strange kind of hope. He dressed carefully, choosing his attire with the same precision he once applied to business meetings. Yet, this wasn't business, it was something far more personal, more vulnerable. As he adjusted his collar in the mirror, he realized that he hadn't felt this kind of anxious anticipation in years. It was as if he were about to face a part of himself he'd long kept hidden. The drive to the hospital felt shorter this time, as though his anticipation had pulled him forward. The city streets blurred past, familiar landmarks fading into the background as he focused on what lay ahead. His mind wandered back to that last night with Emily, her gentle expression, the way her hand had touched the pendant as though it held memories too precious to release. He thought of the hesitation in her voice, the weight of her words when she had said, "It's all I have left of her." Each word had lingered in his mind, each syllable stirring the memories of his daughter he'd so carefully buried. When he arrived at the hospital, Arthur felt a slight tremor in his hands, an unsteady heartbeat that he tried to ignore. He knew his reason for being here was unconventional. There was no medical need for his return, no doctor's appointment to justify his visit. Yet, his need for answers felt as valid, as pressing, as any physical ailment. As he approached the main desk, he rehearsed his words in his mind, a careful script of polite inquiry masking the deeper, personal ache behind it. The receptionist greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Blake. How can we help you today?" He hesitated for a moment, feeling a flicker of self-consciousness. "Good morning," he replied, his voice steady but soft. "I was hoping to speak with Nurse Emily. She looked after me during my last stay, and I wanted to thank her personally." It wasn't a complete lie. gratitude was part of why he was here. But he knew it was only a small fraction of the truth. The receptionist nodded, her fingers tapping at the keyboard. "Of course, let me see if she's on shift today." Arthur held his breath, the few seconds stretching into what felt like hours as he waited. She looked up with a polite smile, confirming, "Yes, she's here today, Mr. Blake. I'll let her know you're waiting. You can have a seat in the visitor's lounge, just over there." Arthur nodded his thanks, his heart pounding as he moved to the waiting area, his steps slow and deliberate as he tried to compose himself. The lounge was quiet, its sterile walls softened by a few plants and comfortable armchairs. Arthur sat down, his hands resting in his lap as he glanced around, feeling oddly exposed in the open space. He was accustomed to control, to managing his surroundings, but here, he was vulnerable, subject to the whims of time and chance. He looked out the window, watching as the autumn leaves drifted past, each one a reminder of the seasons that had passed without Lily. It struck him, in that moment, how much he had allowed his life to fall into a rhythm of solitude, of quiet endurance. And now, with Emily's pendant, a new rhythm seemed to be calling him, one that forced him to confront what he had left behind. He didn't know how long he sat there before a familiar, soft voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Blake." He looked up, startled, to find Emily standing before him, her expression a mix of surprise and warmth. Her hair was tied back, her eyes gentle as they met his, a hint of curiosity flickering in them. "I didn't expect to see you back here so soon," she said, her voice light but kind, as though she understood he must have had a reason beyond simple gratitude. Arthur stood, feeling a faint tremor in his legs as he offered her a small smile. "I apologize for coming unannounced, Emily," he began, his tone genuine. "But I felt it was important to thank you. You were very kind to me during my stay, and I wanted you to know how much I appreciated it." He paused, watching her reaction, hoping she might feel his sincerity. Emily nodded, her own smile softening, though he could see a trace of curiosity in her eyes, as if she sensed there was more he wanted to say. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Blake," she replied, her voice gentle. "It's always nice to see a patient again, especially under better circumstances." She gestured to a quieter corner of the lounge, and they moved there, away from the flow of other visitors and staff. Arthur settled into a chair, his gaze drifting briefly to the pendant around her neck, its familiar shape glinting in the soft light. He felt a pang in his chest, a pull that was as much sorrow as it was curiosity. After a brief, thoughtful silence, he took a breath, steeling himself to ask the question that had been pressing on his heart. "Emily," he began slowly, his voice steady but careful, "last time we spoke, you mentioned that pendant was a gift from someone special. I don't mean to intrude, but..." He hesitated, unsure if he was pushing too far, afraid she might shut down completely. "It reminds me of something from my own past. Would you mind telling me a bit more about it?" Emily's hand moved instinctively to the pendant, her fingers brushing over it protectively. Her expression softened, and Arthur could see the shadow of something deeply personal in her eyes. She looked down, her brow furrowing slightly as if weighing how much to share. "It's not something I talk about often," she admitted, her voice quiet. "But this pendant, it belonged to someone who meant a great deal to me. She gave it to me during a very difficult time in her life, as a way of saying goodbye, I suppose." Arthur's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing as he tried to hold back the questions that surged within him. "A goodbye." The word echoed painfully, conjuring images of his last day with Lily, the hope he'd clung to that it wouldn't be the end. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "I'm sorry to hear that," he managed, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "It sounds like she was very dear to you." Emily nodded, her gaze distant as she looked away, lost in thought. "Yes," she murmured, her voice laced with emotion. She was a light in my life, even in her hardest days. I didn't know her for very long, but the time we spent together, it changed me. She taught me so much about kindness, about resilience, even when she was facing so much herself." Her voice trembled slightly, and she quickly composed herself, her hands still resting over the pendant as though drawing strength from it. Arthur watched her, feeling the weight of her words, the tenderness in her voice a reflection of the love he had once known. He wanted to ask more, to know how Emily had come to know this person, to understand the bond that had formed between them. But he sensed that she was guarding those memories closely, holding them like precious fragments of a life lost too soon. And so, he remained silent, respecting her grief, recognizing it as a mirror of his own. They sat there in quiet reflection, each lost in memories they weren't yet ready to share. And in that silence, Arthur felt something shift within him, a newfound respect for this young nurse who carried her own story of loss, of love, and of resilience. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and shared understanding. Arthur studied Emily's face, seeing the flicker of sadness in her eyes as she gently touched the pendant. Her expression held a quiet reverence, as though she were protecting something sacred, something too fragile to bring into the open. The mystery of her connection to the pendant had become a riddle that both haunted and captivated him, each revelation drawing him deeper into memories he had locked away. He felt a pang of respect for her in that moment, an admiration for the way she carried herself with such grace despite the pain that was clearly etched into her story. He understood what it was to hold onto a memory, to let it define parts of you that you could never explain to others. It was a silent, weighty bond they shared, even if she didn't know the full depth of it. Part of him wanted to reach out, to tell her about Lily, to reveal the reason for his visit and his questions. But he knew he wasn't ready, not yet. The rawness of his emotions, freshly uncovered after years of careful concealment, held him back. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with sincerity. "It sounds like she was an extraordinary person," he said softly, his words carrying the weight of his own memories. "Someone who left a deep impression." Emily's gaze met his, and she offered a faint, grateful smile, the pain in her eyes momentarily softened by his empathy. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "She was. I suppose she taught me more in those few months than most people teach in a lifetime." Her words struck Arthur deeply, resonating with the memories he had of Lily, memories of her boundless kindness, her unguarded laughter, and the way she had always seemed to bring warmth to everyone around her. He hadn't been prepared for the connection he felt to this young nurse, the way her story seemed to overlap with his own in ways that felt impossible and yet undeniable. He wondered how many lives Lily had touched in ways he would never know, and if Emily's friend might somehow be part of that unseen legacy. As they sat there, each wrapped in their own thoughts, Arthur found himself searching for the right words, something that might bridge the gap between them without pressing her too hard. "You know," he said quietly, his tone thoughtful, "sometimes, I think the people who leave us too soon leave behind a part of themselves in the ones who love them. It's a strange comfort, but it's as though they are never entirely gone." His voice softened, and he looked away, unsure if he had said too much, if he had let his own vulnerability show more than he intended. Emily nodded, her eyes reflecting the depth of his sentiment. "I believe that too," she murmured, her hand still resting protectively over the pendant. "I think that's why I wear this. It reminds me that she's still here, somehow. It's my way of honoring her, of carrying a part of her with me." Her words felt like a mirror to his own grief, to the way he had held onto pieces of Lily's memory through the objects she had left behind, the photographs, the letters, and the pendant he had given her so long ago. Arthur felt his chest tighten, his mind racing with questions he dared not ask. He wanted to know everything: how Emily had met this friend, the circumstances that had led to her receiving the pendant, and the moments they had shared. But he held back, respecting the privacy she clearly needed. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the reluctance to delve too deeply into memories that were likely as painful for her as his were for him. And he understood, he knew what it was to protect a memory, to wrap it in silence because speaking of it made it too real, too close. After a few moments, Emily glanced away, gathering herself. She shifted slightly in her seat, her expression thoughtful. "I don't mean to sound cryptic," she said softly, her tone apologetic. "It's just, there are some things that are hard to talk about, you know?" Arthur nodded, his gaze understanding. "I do," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Some memories are too precious to bring into the light. I understand that better than most." His words seemed to resonate with her, and she offered him a gentle, appreciative smile. Their conversation drifted into lighter topics, a mutual understanding forming between them that required no words. They spoke of small things, the changes in the weather, the quietness of the hospital on late nights, and the comfort of routines that allowed one to escape the weight of heavier thoughts. Arthur felt a strange comfort in the simplicity of their conversation, as though each word was a step towards something he couldn't yet define. Her presence had become something steady in his life, a gentle reminder of the kindness he had once known and the connections he had once cherished. As the afternoon light began to dim, Arthur sensed that it was time to leave. But the thought of leaving without any answers, without a clearer understanding of the connection they shared, left him feeling uneasy. He didn't want to press her, didn't want to burden her with his own search for meaning. But he couldn't help himself from asking one final question, his voice tentative and filled with quiet hope. "Emily," he began slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity he hadn't intended, "if it's not too much to ask, would you ever be willing to share more about her? About the friend who gave you that pendant?" Emily hesitated, her gaze softening as she seemed to weigh his request. She looked down at the pendant, her fingers tracing its outline as if it held secrets only she could understand. Finally, she nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe, someday. I think I'd like that," she said, her eyes meeting his with a quiet promise. "But, not yet." Her answer was enough. It was a small opening, a sliver of hope that perhaps, in time, she would trust him with the memories she held so close. Arthur felt a rush of gratitude, a sense of relief that he hadn't expected. He nodded, offering her a warm, understanding smile. "Of course," he replied softly. "Whenever you're ready." He knew he would wait, that he would be patient, and that whatever story she had to share would be worth it, no matter how long it took. As he stood to leave, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet determination to see this through, to honor the connection he sensed between them. As he walked out of the hospital, the autumn air sharp and cool around him, Arthur felt lighter, his heart carrying the warmth of their conversation. Emily had not given him the answers he sought, but she had given him something else, hope, the sense that there was still a story left to uncover, a bond that bridged the years and the losses they had both endured. And for the first time in years, he felt that perhaps, he was not as alone as he had once believed. Arthur left the hospital that day with a strange mixture of peace and restlessness, a quiet, simmering hope blended with an ache that felt nearly unbearable. The more he thought about Emily, the more he felt a gravitational pull toward her, as though some part of his soul recognized something in her that his mind could not fully grasp. She was a mystery wrapped in familiarity, and he was beginning to see that the answers he sought might lie as much in understanding her as in uncovering his daughter's fate. Over the next few days, Arthur found his thoughts repeatedly drifting back to her. He tried to busy himself with the routines of his life, with meetings and investments, anything to keep his mind from lingering too long on the painful possibilities that haunted him. Yet, every quiet moment was filled with the memory of Emily's voice, the way she had touched the pendant, her soft, reserved smile. He couldn't shake the feeling that his journey toward healing had somehow become entwined with hers, as though her story held a piece of the solace he had been searching for. One evening, unable to focus, Arthur retreated to his study, drawn to the comfort of familiar surroundings. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with rare volumes and collected treasures, but they all seemed to fade into the background. His gaze was drawn to the small collection of framed photographs on his desk, and he reached out to pick up the picture of Lily, the same one he had often looked at during his sleepless nights. In the photo, she was no more than 10, her smile wide and unguarded, her pendant catching the sunlight. He traced his finger along the frame, feeling the weight of his memories press down on him. Lily had been his light, his joy, the one person who had seen beyond his wealth and power to the man beneath. Her laughter had once filled every corner of their home, her spirit softening the edges of his life. She had given him a reason to look forward to each day, a purpose that was more profound than anything his business empire had brought him. And then, without warning, she had been taken from him, leaving behind only shadows and echoes of a life he would never fully understand. Sighing, he leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as he allowed himself to feel the weight of that loss. It was a grief he had taught himself to bear in silence, to carry alone, hidden behind the veneer of a successful man who had everything. But now, with the memory of Emily stirring old questions and buried hopes, he felt that veneer cracking, the carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. He knew he was grasping at fragments, and yet those fragments had begun to form a picture he couldn't ignore, a picture that suggested Lily's story might not have ended as he had assumed. As he sat there, the stillness of the room pressing in on him, he realized that he needed to know more. Emily's pendant was more than a piece of jewelry, it was a thread, one that might lead him back to his daughter in ways he couldn't yet understand. He thought of Emily's words, her voice filled with the same quiet sorrow he had felt within himself for so long. "It's all I have left of her." She had said those words with such reverence, such quiet pain, and he had seen in her eyes a reflection of his own grief. She, too, was holding on to a memory, guarding it with the same silent determination he had carried all these years. The next day, Arthur found himself back at the hospital, his heart pounding as he walked through the familiar halls. He hadn't planned to return so soon, but he felt compelled to be there, to see Emily, to find some way of unraveling the mystery that now bound them together. He approached the reception desk, his voice steady as he asked to speak with her. The receptionist informed him that Emily would be on break shortly and suggested he wait in the garden, a small, peaceful area reserved for visitors and staff. The garden was quiet, a sanctuary from the sterile brightness of the hospital. Arthur took a seat on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches shading him from the mid-morning sun. He looked around, taking in the soft sound of birds chirping and the scent of late-blooming flowers. It reminded him of the times he'd taken Lily to the park when she was little, how she'd run ahead, her laughter echoing through the air. Those memories were so vivid, so alive, that he could almost hear her voice calling to him. Lost in thought, he didn't hear Emily approach until she was standing beside him, her presence soft and unassuming. "Mr. Blake," she greeted him with a gentle smile, her voice quiet yet warm. "I didn't expect to see you here again so soon." Her expression held a mixture of surprise and genuine kindness, as though she hadn't anticipated the impact she'd had on him. Arthur looked up, his own face softening as he returned her smile, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation at her presence. "I hope I'm not intruding," he replied, gesturing to the bench beside him. "I wanted to thank you again, and to ask if you might join me for a moment." Emily hesitated briefly, then nodded, taking a seat beside him, her posture relaxed but alert. She glanced at him with a curious, open expression, as though sensing that he had something more to say. Arthur took a steadying breath, his gaze fixed on the pendant that still hung around her neck, its delicate silver catching the light. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the pendant and the friend who gave it to you," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I can see that it means a great deal to you, and I understand if this is difficult, but there's something I need to know. This friend of yours, she must have been someone very special." His words hung in the air, filled with the weight of his own memories, the unspoken question he wasn't yet ready to ask. Emily's expression softened, her gaze dropping as she held the pendant gently between her fingers. She nodded, a faraway look in her eyes as she spoke. "She was," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know her for long, but she had a kindness, a light that was rare. She was the kind of person who could make you feel seen, even when you felt invisible. And even though she was going through her own struggles, she always had time for others." Her voice faltered, and Arthur could see the depth of her affection for this friend, the love and respect that seemed to echo his own memories of Lily. Arthur felt his heart ache, the pain of his loss blending with the quiet reverence in Emily's words. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he pressed gently, unable to resist the pull of his curiosity any longer. "You mentioned that she gave you the pendant as a way of saying goodbye," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "I know it's personal, but do you know why she chose this particular pendant?" His voice was filled with a quiet hope, a barely contained anticipation that he struggled to control. Emily looked down at the pendant, her fingers tracing its delicate outline. She seemed lost in thought, her expression pensive as she weighed his question. After a long moment, she looked up, her gaze filled with a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "I never asked her," she admitted, her voice soft. "But I think it was a way of leaving a part of herself with me. She said once that the lily was a symbol of peace, of beauty that endures despite hardship. And she wanted me to remember that." Arthur felt his throat tighten, the words resonating deeply within him. A symbol of beauty and resilience, a description that seemed to capture the essence of his daughter, the qualities that had made her so irreplaceable. He wanted to tell Emily everything in that moment, to share his story, to reveal the painful secret that had haunted him all these years. But he held back, sensing that the time wasn't yet right. There was a fragility to this moment, a delicate balance that he didn't want to disturb. Instead, he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a beautiful sentiment," he said quietly, his gaze drifting back to the pendant. "It seems fitting." He looked away, the weight of his own grief pressing down on him, mingling with a newfound sense of hope. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he felt closer to understanding, closer to the truth than he had been in years. Arthur's heart beat faster as he sat beside Emily, feeling the weight of a truth that hovered just out of reach. Her words lingered in his mind, each one carrying a resonance that felt painfully familiar. The pendant, the stories of her friend's kindness and resilience, and the symbolism of the lily, each detail wove a thread between Emily's memories and his own aching grief for Lily. He had come so close to speaking his truth, to asking the questions that might finally bring him answers, but he held back, afraid of what he might find. For a long moment, they sat together in silence, the soft murmur of the hospital garden around them. Arthur's gaze drifted to the pendant, its delicate form glinting in the sunlight as it hung against Emily's uniform. He felt a mixture of longing and dread, his chest heavy with the weight of years of unanswered questions. Every detail she had shared felt like a piece of a puzzle, a mystery he had spent so long trying to solve. And yet, as much as he craved answers, he was equally afraid of what they might reveal. The pain of loss had been his constant companion for so long that he had almost forgotten how to live without it. Emily seemed to sense his tension, her expression softening as she looked at him. "Mr. Blake," she began gently, her tone filled with a quiet compassion, "I know that you're carrying something heavy, something you've kept to yourself for a long time. I don't know what it is, but I want you to know that I'm here to listen, if that's ever something you need." Her words were kind, her eyes filled with a sincerity that reminded him so much of Lily, of the warmth and empathy she had once brought into his life. Arthur's throat tightened, and he felt the familiar sting of tears threatening to surface. He hadn't spoken of Lily's disappearance to anyone outside his closest circle, hadn't allowed himself to truly share the depth of his grief with another person. And yet, here, with this young woman who unknowingly held a link to his past, he felt a glimmer of hope that he could finally begin to release the weight he had carried alone for so many years. Taking a deep, trembling breath, Arthur looked down, his hands clasped tightly together as he steadied himself. "Emily," he began slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "there's something I've been wanting to tell you, something that I've kept hidden for a long time." He paused, gathering his thoughts, feeling the emotions welling up as he prepared to share a part of himself he had long kept buried. "I had a daughter. Her name was Lily. She was everything to me." Emily's face softened, her expression filled with empathy as she listened, her gaze unwavering. Arthur felt a warmth in her presence, a quiet encouragement that urged him to continue. "Lily was my light, my joy," he went on, his voice shaking with emotion. "But one day, years ago, she disappeared. I tried everything to find her, private investigators, rewards, searching every possible lead. But she was gone. Just like that." He looked down, his voice trailing off, the pain of his words settling over him like a heavy blanket. Emily's eyes filled with a quiet sorrow, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blake," she said softly, her voice laced with genuine compassion. "I can't imagine the pain you must have gone through." Her touch was grounding, a steady presence that held him in the midst of his grief. Arthur looked at her, feeling a connection that ran deeper than words, a shared understanding that transcended the silence between them. After a moment, he continued, his gaze shifting to the pendant resting against her chest. "The pendant you wear," he said, his voice filled with a mix of hope and hesitation, it's exactly like the one I gave Lily when she was a little girl. I had it made just for her, a gift to remind her of how much she meant to me." His words hung in the air, and he watched Emily's face closely, searching for a flicker of recognition, some hint that she understood the connection between them. Emily's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch the pendant. She looked down at it, her expression filled with surprise and a hint of confusion. "This pendant," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was given to me by a dear friend, someone who was very important to me." Her eyes met his, and Arthur felt a spark of hope, a trembling anticipation that perhaps, finally, he might find a piece of the truth he had sought for so long. The words came slowly, as though each one held a memory, a secret she had been keeping. "She was kind, gentle," Emily continued, her voice filled with emotion. She gave me this pendant before she passed, as a way to say goodbye. She told me it was something precious, something that carried a part of her, and she wanted me to keep it close." Her voice faltered, and she looked away, her gaze distant as though reliving a memory that was both beautiful and painful. Arthur's heart pounded as he listened, each word a shard of both hope and dread. His breath came shallow, his pulse racing as he leaned forward, desperate to understand. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling, do you remember her name?" The question felt fragile, like glass poised to shatter, and he held his breath, bracing himself for her answer. Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting between him and the pendant, as though searching for words that would make sense of what she was feeling. Finally, she looked at him, her expression softening with a mixture of surprise and understanding. "Her name was Lily," she said quietly, her voice filled with an almost reverent sorrow. She told me it was a symbol of hope, something to remind me to keep going, even in the hardest times." Arthur felt a surge of emotions he could barely contain, a rush of grief, relief, and joy mingling together in a way that left him breathless. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at her, his heart swelling with a love and gratitude that felt almost overwhelming. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking, "Lily was my daughter. She was my Lily." The words came out in a rush, and he felt a deep, soul-stirring relief, as though a weight he had carried alone for so long had finally lifted. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and understanding as she looked at him. The pendant between them held a connection that neither had fully understood, a bridge between their stories that had waited years to be revealed. In that moment, they were no longer strangers but two people bound by a shared love, a shared loss, and a memory that had finally come home. The revelation hung between them, settling like the weight of a long-lost memory finally unearthed. Arthur felt his entire world shift, his mind struggling to absorb what Emily had just confirmed, that the person who had given her the pendant, the woman she had loved so dearly, had indeed been his Lily. His daughter. He stared at Emily, his vision blurred by tears, his heart surging with emotions he couldn't name. Relief, grief, joy, and an aching sadness mingled together, each one pulling at him in ways he had never experienced. Emily's face mirrored his shock, her hand still covering her mouth as she struggled to process his words. Her wide, tear-brimmed eyes met his, and he saw in her expression a depth of pain that matched his own. She, too, was grieving, holding onto the memory of Lily with the same reverence he had. It was as though they had been walking parallel paths, carrying the same sorrow, and now, finally, those paths had converged. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them, stealing the breath from their lungs. Arthur tried to steady himself, his hands trembling as he reached for Emily's, desperate for some form of grounding, of reassurance that this was real. She hesitated for a moment before taking his hand, her grip firm yet gentle, as though offering him a lifeline. He felt an overwhelming rush of gratitude and an unexpected kinship with her. This young woman, who had been a stranger only days ago, now felt like family, like a part of Lily's life he hadn't known existed. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of his emotions. "Please, Emily, tell me everything. I need to know about her last days. I thought I'd lost her completely." His words faltered, the desperation in his voice reflecting the years of unanswered questions, of lonely nights wondering if she had been safe, if she had felt loved, if she had known he would have done anything to find her. Emily looked down, her fingers gently tracing the outline of the pendant as she gathered her thoughts, her face etched with a sorrow that spoke to her own loss. "Mr. Blake," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "Lily was a light. Even when she was struggling, even when she was at her weakest, she was kind, selfless. She never let her own pain cloud her compassion for others." Her voice trembled slightly, and Arthur could see that speaking of Lily brought both joy and pain, as though she were reliving those memories while feeling the sharpness of her absence. Arthur's chest tightened, the words filling him with both pride and heartbreak. He could almost see Lily in Emily's description, his vibrant, compassionate daughter who had always cared so deeply for others. It was a relief to know that Lily's kindness had endured, that she had touched Emily's life in profound ways, but it was also a reminder of everything he had lost, of the years that had slipped by without her. Taking a shaky breath, Emily continued, her voice thick with emotion. When I met her, she was already ill, but she rarely spoke of it. She never wanted anyone to worry. She would spend her days reading, painting, or talking to people in the hospital. She had this way of making everyone around her feel important, like they mattered, even if they were just strangers passing by. Emily's gaze grew distant, her eyes reflecting a deep respect and admiration for Lily. She would always say that life was a gift, even in the hardest moments. Arthur felt tears spill over, his heart breaking all over again as he listened. He could picture his Lily, the gentle soul he had cherished, bringing light to others even as she faced her own darkness. She had always been like that, caring, empathetic, almost too selfless for her own good. He felt a surge of both pride and guilt, wondering if she had known, in those final days, just how much she had meant to him, how fiercely he had loved her. She never talked about her family, Emily said softly, her voice laced with sorrow, but I could tell that she missed someone deeply. She would look out the window sometimes, like she was waiting for something, or someone. I didn't ask, she seemed so protective of that part of her life, like it was something too precious to share. Her eyes met his, filled with an unspoken understanding. I think she was waiting for you, Mr. Blake. Even if she didn't say it, I believe she was waiting. Arthur's breath caught, the realization hitting him with a force he hadn't expected. All those years, he had convinced himself that she had simply vanished, that she had slipped away from his life without warning. But hearing Emily's words, he understood that Lily had been waiting for him, had held on to hope, even in her illness, that he might find her. The guilt weighed heavily on him, a reminder of all the years he had spent blaming himself for not being there, for not searching harder. Yet, in her waiting, he also felt a quiet grace, a forgiveness he hadn't dared to give himself. Unable to contain his sorrow, Arthur pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the ache spread through him as he tried to hold back the sobs that threatened to surface. Emily's hand tightened around his, her grip steady and comforting, as though anchoring him to the moment. She didn't speak, but her presence was a balm to his pain, a silent reminder that he was not alone in his grief. After a long pause, Arthur found his voice again, his words choked with emotion. Did she ever mention me? Did she say anything that would let me know she forgave me for not finding her? The question was heavy with years of unspoken remorse, of the shame he had carried for not being there, for not saving her. He needed to know that she had not left this world feeling abandoned, feeling unloved by the father who had cherished her more than life itself. Emily's expression softened, her eyes filling with a kindness that seemed to reach into the depths of his pain. She didn't speak much of her past, but there was one thing she said to me, something I've held on to all these years, Emily whispered, her voice filled with reverence. She told me that love is something that exists beyond words, beyond time and place. She said that even if you couldn't be with someone, love had a way of finding them, of letting them know they weren't alone. She believed in that, Mr. Blake. She believed in it with all her heart. Arthur closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him, filling the cracks that grief had left in his heart. He clung to those words as if they were a lifeline, a gift from Lily that reached across time, softening the sharp edges of his guilt. In her own way, Lily had left him a message, a final assurance that she had known his love, that she had felt it, even in his absence. It was a gift he hadn't expected, a forgiveness he hadn't dared to hope for. They sat in silence for a long while, the weight of their shared grief heavy but no longer unbearable. Arthur felt a profound gratitude toward Emily, a connection that transcended words. She had been Lily's friend, her confidant, the person who had held a piece of her heart when he couldn't. And now, through her, he had found a part of Lily he thought he had lost forever. Thank you, he whispered finally, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you for keeping her memory alive, for carrying a piece of her with you. Emily smiled, her own eyes glistening with tears as she nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. She had become the keeper of Lily's spirit, a bridge between the past and the present, and in sharing her memories, she had given Arthur the closure he had spent years searching for. As they sat together, each wrapped in the memory of a woman who had changed them both, Arthur felt the beginnings of peace. It wasn't a peace that erased the pain or the years of loss, but it was a peace that acknowledged them, that allowed him to carry Lily's memory forward with a gentleness he hadn't known before. The garden was quiet as the afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the flowers, illuminating Arthur and Emily as they sat together in the stillness. The weight of the shared memories between them hung in the air, each one like a soft thread woven into a tapestry of love and loss. Arthur felt a peace he hadn't known in years, a sense of connection to Lily that he had thought lost to him forever. Through Emily's words, he could feel his daughter's presence, her laughter, her kindness, her strength, each memory becoming real, vibrant, almost tangible. As he sat there, he looked at Emily, realizing how much she had become to him, not just as a stranger connected to Lily, but as someone who had brought his daughter back to him in a way he could never have anticipated. He saw a part of Lily's legacy reflected in her, in the way Emily had loved and honored her, and he knew that this bond between them, forged by shared grief and remembrance, would remain unbreakable. "Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude, "you've given me something I thought I'd never have again. You've brought her back to me. Thank you." Emily's face softened, her eyes glistening with emotion as she looked at him. "Mr. Blake," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, "knowing Lily changed my life in ways I can't even explain. She taught me to see the beauty in life, even in the hardest moments. I can't describe how much it means to me to know that I could give some of her back to you." Her voice was filled with a quiet strength, and Arthur could see the love and respect she carried for his daughter, the memory of Lily held with a reverence that both comforted and healed him. After a moment of silence, Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. His hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a simple but beautiful gold ring, adorned with a single sapphire that glinted in the sunlight. It had once belonged to Lily, a gift he had given her on her 18th birthday, something she had cherished and worn every day until she disappeared. He had kept it in his drawer all these years, unable to part with it, hoping against hope that one day she might return to claim it. "I want you to have this," he said quietly, holding the box out to Emily. She looked at him, her expression one of surprise and quiet awe. This was Lily's. She wore it every day, and I know she would have wanted it to be with someone who loved her, someone who understood her in ways I couldn't. His voice faltered, thick with emotion, but he continued, "You brought her back to me, Emily, in a way I never thought possible. I know she would have wanted you to have this as a reminder of her, as a part of her story that lives on in you." Emily's hand trembled as she reached for the box, her gaze fixed on the ring as though it held a piece of Lily's spirit. She looked up at Arthur, her eyes filled with gratitude and humility. "Mr. Blake, I don't know what to say. This means more to me than I can express." She swallowed, a tear slipping down her cheek. Lily, she always spoke of hope, of believing in connections that transcend time and distance. I think she'd be honored that we found each other." They sat in silence, each lost in their own memories of Lily, their hearts connected by the love they held for her. In that moment, Arthur felt as though he were no longer grieving a loss but celebrating a life that had touched others, a life that continued through the people who had loved her. The grief was still there, a quiet ache that would always remain, but it was softened by a warmth, a healing presence that felt like a final gift from his daughter. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Arthur took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He stood, offering his hand to Emily, who accepted it with a grateful smile. Together, they walked through the garden, taking in the beauty around them, the gentle reminder that life, even with its sorrows, held moments of connection and grace. In the weeks that followed, Arthur found himself returning to the hospital often, not as a patient but as a friend. He and Emily would sit together during her breaks, sharing stories, memories, and quiet moments of reflection. Their bond grew, becoming a source of strength and comfort for them both. For Arthur, Emily became a part of his life, a reminder of Lily's love, and for Emily, Arthur became a guardian of the memories they both cherished, a figure of support and respect. In time, Arthur felt his heart healing, each day bringing him closer to a sense of acceptance, a gratitude for the love that Lily had left behind. He knew he would always carry her memory, that her presence would forever be a part of him. But he no longer felt weighed down by guilt or unanswered questions. Instead, he felt free, connected to a future that was brightened by the love and memory of his daughter. As he stood one day in his garden, watching the lilies bloom with a quiet joy, he smiled, feeling Lily's spirit in the gentle breeze, in the warmth of the sun, in the laughter that now filled his life once more. And he knew, in that quiet, peaceful moment, that she was with him, guiding him forward, her memory a light that would never fade. If you like this story, take the opportunity to see the others that are appearing on your screen right now. Subscribe to the channel and comment on what you thought of this story. See you soon. Bye.